Before dawn on April 18, 1942, the Pacific heaved under a low ceiling of cloud as the aircraft carrier Hornet drove westward into rising seas. Spray burst over her bow and skidded the length of the flight deck where 16 Army B-25 Mitchell bombers stood lashed in tight formation. Their twin tails cut dark shapes against the gray horizon. Sailors moved carefully between the aircraft, checking lines, wiping salt from canopies, and waiting for orders that would commit the task force to an operation without precedent. The plan had been formed in the uneasy months following Pearl Harbor. American carriers were few, and the Japanese perimeter seemed to expand by the week. Yet a proposal emerged from hurried consultations in Washington: launch medium Army bombers from a Navy carrier, strike the Japanese home islands, and continue westward to China. The aircraft would not return. The distance left no margin for hesitation, and success depended on surprise. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle was chosen to lead the mission. A respected pilot and engineer, he studied the dimensions of a carrier deck and determined that a fully loaded B-25 could lift off within the available length if wind and engine power were sufficient. Crews were drawn from volunteers. At a secluded field in Florida, they practiced short takeoffs, pushing throttles forward against locked brakes, then releasing in a burst of acceleration meant to simulate a pitching deck. Bombers were modified with extra fuel tanks and stripped of unnecessary weight. Only Doolittle and a small circle of planners knew the intended targets. In early April, the bombers were hoisted aboard the Hornet in California. Their presence left little room for error. The carrier's own air group had been removed to make space. Captain Marc Mitscher oversaw every lash and brace, knowing that once at sea, the aircraft could not be repositioned. Admiral William F. Halsey took command of the task force that would escort the carrier across the Pacific. A second carrier, Enterprise, provided fighter cover and reconnaissance. The ships advanced under radio silence. Weather reports were studied carefully, and fuel calculations were reviewed again and again. The bombers were to launch roughly 400 miles from Japan, close enough to conserve fuel, yet far enough to avoid immediate interception. As the task force crossed into waters patrolled by Japanese picket boats, tension deepened. Every horizon scan carried consequence. Shortly after sunrise on April 18th, a lookout sighted a small vessel ahead. It was identified as a Japanese patrol boat stationed to warn of approaching fleets. Gunfire from the cruiser Nashville quickly disabled it, but intercepted signals suggested that a message had already been transmitted. The task force was still farther from Japan than planned. Continuing west risked air or surface attack against the carriers themselves. Launching immediately would force the bombers to fly hundreds of additional miles on already narrow fuel margins. Halsey, Mitscher, and Doolittle conferred in the chart room. The seas were heavy, and the carrier pitched sharply into the wind. Doolittle recalculated range against headwinds and concluded that the mission could proceed if crews maintained strict fuel discipline. Delay invited greater danger. The order was given to launch at once. The Hornet turned into the wind. Engines coughed to life across the deck, propellers clawing at the air. Doolittle's bomber rolled forward first. He held the brakes, advanced throttles to full power, then released. The aircraft surged ahead, tires striking the deck as the bow lifted on a swell. At the final feet of planking, the bomber dropped slightly toward the water before climbing into the wind. Sailors watched until it steadied and banked away. One after another, the remaining aircraft followed. Each takeoff demanded precise timing between pilot and ship's motion. In several cases, the bombers lifted only at the last moment, wheels clearing the edge as spray burst upward beneath them. Within an hour, all 16 aircraft were airborne, circling briefly before setting course west. The carriers turned east and withdrew at speed. The bombers flew low over open water to avoid detection. Crews monitored fuel consumption closely, adjusting power settings to preserve range. As the Japanese coastline emerged through haze, the aircraft climbed slightly to cross terrain and then descended toward their targets. Air raid sirens began to sound in Tokyo and other cities, but warning time was short. Doolittle approached an industrial complex in Tokyo associated with military supply. He released his bombs at low altitude and saw explosions ripple across rooftops and storage yards. Other crews struck docks in Yokohama, factories in Nagoya, and industrial facilities in Kobe and Osaka. Anti-aircraft fire rose in scattered bursts, yet accuracy was limited by surprise and the bombers' low approach. Japanese fighter response proved uneven, and engagements were brief. Fires ignited across several districts as the aircraft turned toward the East China Sea. Headwinds strengthened, fuel gauges dropped steadily. Navigators recalculated distances to the designated airfields in China and found little reserve remaining. Darkness fell before land appeared beneath the clouds. Unable to locate fields with certainty and unwilling to risk engine failure over mountainous terrain, Doolittle ordered crews to prepare to abandon their aircraft once over territory believed to be under Chinese control. One by one, bombers were left behind as parachutes opened against the night sky. Several aircraft crash-landed in fields and along riverbanks. One crew diverted north and landed in the Soviet Union, where they were interned under neutrality regulations. Chinese civilians and soldiers aided many of the downed airmen, guiding them through occupied regions where Japanese patrols searched intensely. Some crews were captured, others reached safety after days of movement through rugged countryside. Japanese forces conducted reprisals in areas suspected of assisting the Americans, extending the human cost of the operation far beyond the original targets. In Washington, the announcement that American aircraft had struck Japan carried immediate impact. President Franklin Roosevelt referred obliquely to the launch point as Shangri-La, preserving operational secrecy while acknowledging the strike. In Tokyo, military authorities assessed limited physical damage yet recognized the breach of home island security. Naval planners accelerated proposals intended to draw American carriers into decisive battle. Doolittle returned to the United States uncertain of his standing, having lost all 16 aircraft as planned. Instead, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Surviving crewmen were decorated as reports were compiled and intelligence extracted from their observations. Across the Pacific, preparations intensified. Japanese carrier forces redeployed to extend their defensive perimeter and eliminate remaining American naval strength. In Pearl Harbor, repair crews labored over flight decks and machinery, racing to restore ships to readiness. Replacement aircraft were assembled and assigned to air groups whose training cycles were shortened by necessity. Communications traffic increased as cryptanalysts worked to interpret Japanese intentions. By late May, carriers on both sides were moving again across the Central Pacific. Fuel, ordnance, and aircraft were loaded in quantities calculated to sustain operations far from established bases. Charts were marked with new rendezvous points and projected lines of approach. The consequences of April's gamble traveled forward with those fleets, shaping the deployments that would converge in early June near a small atoll called Midway. If you've liked this content, consider subscribing and liking this video. Comment down below on your thoughts or what you'd like to see next.